Can you hear me now? Am I on back there? All right. What? Do I look like Mr. Green Jeans? Don't answer that. All right. I got to get going. I got to get started. I got to talk at an average speed of 200 words per minute with gusts up to 250 because I have a lot of ground to cover. Title of the message this morning is Under Grace. You ever walk into a motel or a restaurant or a store, and at the front door or even on the outside billboard telling you that the store was open, seeing the message, under new management? Because I haven't seen one for a long time, but I have seen them before, back in the days of Mr. Green Jeans. No. Anyway, under new management. And from that sign, we can understand that prior management must have failed, must have messed up, must have about put the motel or the restaurant or the store out of business and either quit on their own or were dismissed, and ownership brought in new management, and thus the sign under new management with the intent of straightening things out, making things better, turning a profit, and you know what else goes with it. Well, last week we established by grace. By grace we are delivered from sin. And you see, by sin, you are, excuse me, I got that word, strike that phrase. Hit the delete button. I'm going to start it over. By grace, you are under grace. Because you see, as the manager of your life, we failed, we messed up, we sinned, and sin got a hold of us and kept hold of us. And whatever sin said to do, that we did. And we died because sin killed us. And we were really in a fix. And along came God, and God brought plenty of grace. And by grace we were delivered. And by grace we are under grace. And by grace we are under new management. And to really drive that home, and you don't have to say it out loud, I don't ask you to do that very often, but I want you to say to yourself this sentence: I am under new management. I am under new management. Turn with me, if you would, to Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6, I'm going to read to you 3 verses, beginning with verse number 12. Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body, that you should obey its lusts. And do not go on presenting the members of your body to sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. For sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under law, but under grace? May it never be. You and I, we are under new management. And management's name is grace. And the word under has everything to do with place. And it actually means below or beneath. When I was a young kid growing up on the home farm, we had 2 dogs that liked to lay under underneath the front porch. We had a cat that liked to lay underneath the front steps. Over the years, I have seen children, and this is not a suggestion, young people, please hear that. This is not a suggestion, it is certainly not encouragement, but over the years, I have seen children who like to lay underneath the pew. Grab them quick. All right. Underneath. But here the word goes beyond just position, because the word carries with it the impact of subjection. And when we are subjected, or when we subject ourselves, and either way it can happen, we put ourselves below or beneath whatever is over us. And yes, that's the completion of the definition. To be under means that we are below or beneath whatever is over us. In this case this morning, by grace, you are under grace. You are below, you are beneath grace. And I'll tell you what, brothers and sisters, that's not a bad place to be. Under grace. You are under its power, you are under its authority. You are below it, you are beneath it. And that's a good place to be. But you see, to really understand what we're talking about here this morning, to really understand the text that I've already read to you in verses 12 through 15, we have to pull a Walmart trick. And the Walmart trick is we're going to roll back. We're not going to roll back the prices, we're going to roll up the text. And we're going to roll all the way back to verse number 1. Because in verse number 1, we get the understanding what is about to be talked about. And sorry, we in the Christian Church, Church of Christ, who have used Romans chapter 6 often and many times as a proof text or a springboard for arguing and defending baptism, that's not what this text is about. That's not what the context is about of Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6, from what we know as verse 1 through verse 23, is about two things. It's about sin and it's about grace. And Paul, the author of Romans, just simply takes the opportunity to tightly weave in a very tight pattern baptism into it. And he weaves it in so tightly that you cannot remove it. Okay? You can't remove it. It's there. And it's there naturally. And it's there simply as part of the text. Because again, the passage, Romans 6, talks about sin and grace. Fact of the matter is, in the New American Standard Translation, Paul uses the word sin 22 times. He uses the word grace 3. He uses it right off the bat in verse number 1, uses it once in verse 14, uses it again in verse 15, and then he's done. But I want to suggest to you, I am suggesting to you, that what he is talking about in chapter 6 is not sin. He's talking about grace and what grace has the power to do to sin. And grace bringing us out from under sin and bringing us underneath grace. And he moves along to verses 3 and 4, where he talks about being buried into Christ through baptism. In verse number 4, he says that we are buried into Christ through baptism in order that as Christ was raised from the dead, we too might walk in the newness of life. And you see, really because of grace, by grace, and by grace you are under grace. That's really what he's talking about to us. is he's talking to us about new life in Christ. And the word new here means totally that. Totally brand new. You thanks for getting the nostalgia started. I mean, this is going to work really good. Remember the magic pads we used to have as children? It's been a long time. Do they still make them today? Okay. Magic pads where you could take a plastic pencil with no lead and really a rounded point, and you could make all kinds of lines and draw all kinds of pictures. And, you could sit there and draw a picture of your sister when she wasn't looking, and you didn't have to show it to her. And if she got up out of her chair to come see what you were doing, all you had to do was grab the bottom of the film and rip it up real quick, and voila, the picture's gone. You know what? That's what grace does. That's what God does through his grace. He takes your life, which is messed up, we've made mistakes, and by his grace, through your faith, he just takes the bottom of the film and pulls it up, and we get to start over. And pretty much that's what grace is all about, is the opportunity to start over. And it is new in quality. You ever think about getting to start your life all over? When you became a Christian, when you were buried in Christian baptism to be raised to walk in the newness of life, you got to start your life over. Your slate, your pad, it was clean. It was all gone. All the blackness was gone. And then along came the Etch-a-Sketch, and you can draw forever on it. But all you've got to do is turn it over and go like this several times and turn it back over, and there's nothing there. Brothers and sisters, that's what grace does. Grace takes away everything dark, all the sin. And again, you know what? And I realize what I may be about to say, but I've said it before. I'm going to say it again. Baptism doesn't need to be argued. It doesn't need to be defended. Nowhere in Scripture do I find that is argued or defended. It's just taken for natural. It's a natural part. What baptism needs to be is understood. And in order to understand it, you've got to get away from the water. Get away from the water. And I don't know what technical term that we need to put to it, but I'm going to put this one to it. Back away from the water and approach the theology of baptism, and you will begin to find that everything doesn't happen on top of the water. It happens below the surface of the water, if you will, underneath the water. And because it happens below the top of the water or the surface of the water and beneath the water, everything that happens has to be accepted by faith. So you know what? If you don't have the faith that takes you and leads you to the baptistry, you don't belong there. It's as simple as that. It needs to be faith that takes you from here to there. And you know what? It's faith that makes baptism work. And because it's faith that makes baptism work, I'm going to also tack on that faith and grace cannot be separated. So if it's faith that makes baptism work, then baptism is grace from God that he lets you get anyways near the baptistry. And when baptism is by faith through God's grace, that you get to go there and you get to be there and you get to be baptized into Christ, and you get to start over Wow. And moving on, because I've been there longer than I intended to be. Moving on, drop down to verse number 6. Because in verse number 6, you will read, knowing that that our old man was crucified with him. Okay? We talked a lot last week about being dead because of sin, because sin killed us. And here we're not only dead, but we get to die again. And yeah, I've pondered all week long how I'm going to get that communicated, how I'm going to make that clear. We're already dead because of sin, and yet we get to die again. How do you do that, Don? Well, in this case, you are dead, but we need to die to self. That's what the old man is. That's who the old man is. No, the old man's not me. The old man is my old sinful self, my old sinful nature. And when I understand the gospel, when I understand that Jesus Christ died for my sins, was buried for 3 days in a borrowed tomb, on the third day was raised by the power of God to walk in the newness of life, that's exactly what needs to happen to me. Die to self, buried in a tomb. And you see, the text itself gives us the clues that we need to understand baptism. Okay? All right? Because it's not a Christian church doctrinal position. It's a God position. It's a word position. We don't need to do it because that's what the Christian church says. We need to do it because that's what God says. That's what God says. And do you hear why it's partly, in part, why it's necessary and why it's significant and why it's important? Because it's a burial. Anybody here had a relative die? Yeah, probably most of us. Okay. Are they still at home sitting in a chair? Did they have a favorite car in the garage and you put them in the garage? What did you do with them? When somebody dies, don't we take them, put them in a coffin? The coffin goes into the vault, and the vault's already setting in a 4 by 6 by 8 hole. Yeah? Do you understand that Paul in Romans chapter 6 is calling baptism a tomb, a burial plot? And yet, if we were to drain the baptistry, anybody got a guess? Anybody want to propose how many old men, how many old lives might be laying? I'm in front of it hard. Might be laying in the bottom of this baptistry? You guys getting concerned? But if we drained it, you know how many we'd find? None. You see, that in itself makes baptism work by faith. That Jesus removes your old man, your old self. It's buried beneath the watery surface. I like to take individuals after they've dried off and come back out in dry clothes. I like to take those individuals back to the baptistry and say, you know what? At the bottom of this grave lies your old man, your old self. Don't ever think you can be a grave robber and come back and get him and put him on. Stay away from your grave. You don't need to be there. You don't want to put the old man back on. All right? Because you just don't. Because you'll get yourself into a whole lot of trouble. Moving on from verse number 6, that our body of sin might be done away. Actually, there's a that our body of sin might be done away. You see, that's the whole problem. That's the problem causer. Is sin finds a weak spot in the old man and goes to work and grabs hold of it and starts giving him all kinds of ideas and all kinds of lust and all kinds of this and all kinds of that. And the next thing you know, the old man's trapped and he can't get out. But when we are buried in the likeness of Christ's death, that we might be in the likeness of his resurrection, the old man is at the bottom of the watery grave where he needs to be and where he needs to stay. And we can walk in the newness of life because we rise up a free individual, free from the power of sin, free from the rule of sin, free from the authority of sin. And that's why you and I can walk in the newness of life. And if you ever have, and if you have had the opportunity to baptize, to bury someone into Christ and pull them back up out of the water to walk in the newness of life, do you realize, do you understand that for a few fleeting seconds, you hold in your hands a sinless human being? You ever thought about that? Wow. Doesn't last very long, but nonetheless, when they come up out of the water and rise to walk in the newness of life, they're a sinless human being. Wow. Moving on. For he who has died is freed from sin. And you see, that's God's plan. That's the crux of it, is in order to overcome anything, you have to die to it. But you see, when God's involved, it's not a risk. You're not risk-taking. It's not like playing chicken on Friday night or Saturday night with two different cars coming from different directions. When you decide it's time to die to yourself and you give up yourself and you say, God, I'm yours, you're in good hands. Fact of the matter is, you're in better hands than being in the hands of Allstate. All right? You're in better hands than being in the hands of Allstate, because you're in God's hands and you're freed from sin. And then he gets real factual, because he goes into concluding with verse number 8. Now if, and you see, if here becomes a conditional preposition. Now, if we have died with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with him. You see, in order to become alive in Christ, first you've got to die with him. And what does the grave do? Doesn't the grave prove death? Isn't that why we bury someone? Is because they have died? Why was Jesus buried for 3 days? Because God wanted to prove to the world that his only begotten Son had died. Why did they bury Lazarus? They didn't bury Lazarus because Jesus was out of town. They buried Lazarus because he died. Remember what his sister said when Jesus said, roll back the stone? Jesus, don't do that. There's going to be a stench. He's been in there 4 days. Jesus was in there 3. And what I've learned from funeral directors over the years, there would have been a stench. He wanted to prove that his son had died, wanted to prove that his son was dead, so that when he came back to life, and you see, that's the process. It's dying to something so that you can be raised and come back to life. And when you die to it and come back to life, it's been conquered. It's been conquered. And you see, that's what grace has done. Grace has taken you when you were dead and has buried you in the Christian grave, in the watery grave of baptism, and he has raised you to walk in the newness of life. And death is no longer your master. Excuse me, well, that too. Sin is no longer your master. Sin no longer rules. Sin no longer has dominion over you. You're free. As fastly as I can do it, and I ain't going to be fast enough. Well, I'll tell you what. I'll just close right here, because I read a book on the Civil War some time ago. And it was about a Negro slave who had such a strong desire to be free. And he lived in this little small town in Alabama or Georgia. And the town was deserted because they knew the Union forces were just across the Rappahannock River, and they would attack the town the next day, and anybody who wanted to escape the Union force attack could get out of town, and most people did. He hung around because he had no place to go. He had no other place to flee to. And sure enough, at 7 a.m. the next morning, just shortly after sunrise, the Union forces cut loose with cannons. And then they set their military, their ground forces across the river in rowboats and attacked the town. But because it was basically deserted and there wasn't anybody there, the fight was over in 30 minutes. And the Negro slave is standing at the end of Main Street, right along the Rappahannock River, when he looks out, and here comes the Union Army leader standing up in the middle of a rowboat, being rowed across the Rappahannock by some of his troops. And they get to the bank on his side of the river, and I think he was a colonel or a corporal, I can't remember what he was, been too long since I read the book, but he stepped onto dry land, walked right up to the Negro slave and said, "Sir," he introduced himself, "would you like to get back in the boat and cross the river to freedom with me?" And he was so excited. He said, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I would. I want to be free. I want to be free. Let me secure things, and then I'll come back and get you, and we'll get in the boat together, and we'll row you across to freedom." He looked around. He put another member of his detachment in charge. He went back to the man, put his arm around his shoulders, and said, "Come with me, sir. We're going to row you to freedom." And they both got into the boat. And those who rowed the army leader across began to row back. And the closer they got to the bank, for the first time, his eyes locked in on what had made him free. And as they reached the bank on the far side and both stepped out onto dry ground, there, a short distance off to his right, were 6 long white bumps with red stains coming through each that covered 6 soldiers' bodies. And at that instant, he was so overwhelmed, he fell to his knees and wept. 6 men who gave their lives for his freedom, freedom from slavery. And brothers and sisters, when it comes to you and me, when it comes to us, there was one body wrapped in white cloths, staining it red from the blood that flowed from his body. But the wraps didn't last. On the morning of the 3rd day, God, through his power, rolled away the stone, breathed new life into the body of his son. His son came alive and walked out the door and began greeting his disciples. By grace, you are under grace. 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 By grace, you're under grace. You thought I'd forgot back there, didn't you? By grace, you're under grace. We need to live. We need to live like it. By grace, under grace. Consider yourselves as one who was dead to sin, as one who is dead to sin, but alive to Christ through God. You know what? We've all got a decision to make again this morning. It's just not the non-believer that needs to make it. If you have not honored or respected or praised God enough for His grace, your opportunity to reverse that is right now. You can do it where you stand. You can do it where you stand. You can come down here and tell us what you're doing, and the elders and I will greet you here and meet you here. If you've not come in contact, if you're not under grace yet, if you're not by grace yet, come on down. Today's the day that your sin can be taken away and that you can come under grace and start to live by grace. Ephesian hymn. What is it? 653. Let's stand as we sing that together. Jesus, I long